Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. We're doing one Bible story at a time each week, going through the Bible. We started with Genesis way back, years ago now, and now we've made it all the way through 1 Samuel. We're picking all the most important stories, and I'm sending out a paraphrasing of the stories each week, written in sort of a more contemporary storytelling format. So it's not a translation. It's not exactly perfectly accurate in that sense, but it's easier to follow from a narrative perspective for 21st century ears. So if you'd like to receive the paraphrasing each week, just shoot me an email at the email that is on your screen right now, and I will send one out to you Tuesday afternoon before we have the study. Good evening, Stella. Good to have you here tonight. Good evening, John. Good evening, Mike and Kim. Please say hi if you're with us so we can say hi back at you. Somebody was asking if I know when people watch after the fact. In other words, if they're not watching live, if they watch later, do I know? And yes, I do, because many of you say, hi, I'm watching on Wednesday, which is great as well. Also, I can go back in and find out how many people viewed, and those numbers are always a little off because anybody who scroll passes it and has autoplay turned on, that'll show up as a view. But I also know who has viewed for more than a minute, and most people who watch more than a minute stick all the way through. So yes, I do know. Do I check often? Not particularly. And that I just whatever you're watching and paying attention and reading, we're just glad to have you. So we're going to go ahead and begin now with a word of prayer, shall we? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The reason they were asking is because the book club had their Christmas party tonight, and some of them are still here, I think, which means they're not watching right now. They won't probably until later tonight or tomorrow. And of course, it's Christmas week and might be a little while. And so just a reminder, and I'll mention this again later, we're not going to meet next week. We're not going to meet the following week. We're taking 2 weeks off for Christmas and New Year's. All right, so today I titled this The Death of Saul and Jonathan, but that's wrong. It's The Deaths of Saul and Jonathan. I know how to write good. Hello, Rob and Tony and excuse me, from Southern Maryland. Good to have you with us tonight. All right, so a little bit of a longer lesson tonight. And the first portion of it is my paraphrasing of the narrative portion. The second portion is poetic verse. And I don't write poetry, and I don't know how to paraphrase poetry and be respectful of it in that way. So I decided to include that portion in the original text of the World English Bible, which is the version that I have been using to base the paraphrasing on, and I've been using that mainly because it's public domain, and we're not doing a closed format here like on Zoom. We're doing an open format where anybody can watch at any time, and just to be on the safe side, I wanted to use something that was public domain, and that is the only current translation that is in the public domain. There is one that's being done in the Creative Commons license, I think, but at any rate, so we're starting with 1 Samuel 31, and we're finishing up through 2 Samuel chapter 1. So the last chapter of 1 Samuel and the first chapter of 2 Samuel. The Philistines went to war with Israel. At Mount Gilboa, Israel's army turned and ran. Many were killed. Archers wounded Saul and killed his sons. He turned to his armor-bearer and said, "Kill me. If these pagans take me alive, they'll torture me." But he refused. Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that he was dead, he fell on his sword too. Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer died together that day. When the Israelite soldiers fighting on the other side of the valley heard what had happened, they fled. The cities they abandoned were taken by the Philistines. The next day, as the Philistines stripped the dead, they found Saul and his sons on Mount Gilboa. They put his armor on display in the temple of Astarte. They cut off his head and put his body on display, nailing it to the city wall at Beth Shan. Then they sent messengers carrying the news throughout the land. The news reached Jabesh Gilead. That night, a few brave men went out and retrieved the bodies of Saul and his sons. They cremated them and buried their bones under a tree. Then they fasted for 7 days. David had been fighting the Amalekites when all of this happened. He didn't get the news until he had been back in Ziklag for 3 days. One of Saul's men arrived and bowed down before him. David asked him, "Where did you come from?" "I've just come back from the war. I barely escaped." David asked, "What happened?" "We lost. Everyone who didn't run is dead, including Saul and Jonathan." David said, "How do you know Saul and Jonathan are dead?" "I was out Mount Gilboa, and I saw Saul fall on his sword. The chariots were closing in, and Saul called out to me. He wasn't dead yet, but he was dying, and he asked me to finish him off. He was suffering, so I did. I brought his crown and his armband to you." David and his men ripped their clothes, wept, and fasted the rest of the day. They weren't just mourning for Saul and his sons, but for all of the fallen soldiers and the rest of the Lord's people. David asked the messenger, "Where are you from?" "My father was an Amalekite, but I was born in Israel." David said, "Then you should have known better than to kill the Lord's anointed. Your blood is on your own hands." He turned to one of his men and said, "Kill him." And he did. David wrote a lament for Saul and Jonathan, and he ordered his men to teach it to their children so that it could be handed down forever. It was recorded in the book of Yashar. And the lament is, "Your glory, Israel, was slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Don't tell it in Gath. Don't publish it in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. You, mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain on you, and no fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled and cast away. The shield of Saul was not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, Jonathan's bow didn't turn back. Saul's sword didn't return empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives. In their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you delicately in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your clothing. How the mighty have fallen in the middle of the battle. Jonathan was slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished." This is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. Good evening, Linda. Good to have you here tonight. So I got a couple of questions today. First time in a while I've gotten questions, and I just thought of another one. I'll leave that one alone. All right, so the second question that I got that I did not have time to research was, what are the ethical implications of the desecration of a corpse in biblical times? And that's a very good question, and I don't know a detailed answer to that question. I'll tell you what I do know. Certainly, Judaism has rules for how the dead are to be handled, and there are also rules about the people who handle the dead and how they should be handled, because if you handle a corpse, then you're ritually unclean, and you have to go through a purification process. The same is true for battle. Anybody who's been through battle can't just go back into society. They have to have some time apart to get right with God, basically. So there are rules, and I here I am stuttering. I think the gist of it is most ancient cultures had rules about how you treat bodies and about how you are respectful to bodies. And most ancient cultures were offended when you mistreated a body. And for that reason, mistreatment of bodies was commonplace in warfare. So it's wrong for us to mistreat our bodies, and it's wrong for them to mistreat our bodies. But because they think it's wrong for us to mistreat their bodies, we're going to do that to send a message. So there was, it was routine for people to make examples out of bodies like this up until very recent times, and even in the 20th century, there were instances when even American soldiers have done things that should never have happened, and those things tended to happen in the absolute worst situations of close-in combat, where people have been in hand-to-hand, close-up combat for extended periods of time, and are absolutely at the very extreme limit of their psychological tether. That's when people start making examples out of corpses, and it's an awful thing, but it happens. It's part of our brokenness as humanity, but it does seem to have been done systematically by people who would have been offended if it had been done to them, and it seems to have been done systematically for that very reason, to offend the nation of the person you're doing it to. That's all I can say about that. I don't know the particulars of this case with the Philistines or the Israelites. I just know that yes, it was offensive. It was intended to be so. It was also intended to send a message. The gist of the result of this battle is that the Philistines have seized control of the Jezreel Valley, and they're putting that body on display to show who's in charge now, and to show Israel that their king is dead. Wish I knew more about that, but that's all I know. The second question that I got had to do with the book of Yashar, and do I know anything about it? That's a great question. So the books in the Bible that we would consider to be history books, and they're not every book in the Bible is a history book. The Bible is an anthology. It's a collection of a bunch of different works, and they're all from different points in history, and they all give us insight into different points in history, but they're not all histories. The books that we consider to be historical books are Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and I would throw in there 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but 1st and 2nd Chronicles are very similar to 1st and 2nd Kings. Right. So those are the historical books. And those books are not the original accounts of the stories that are in those books. These books were compiled and edited, we think, by whoever. This is the primary theory, the theory that I was trained in, the theory that I still stick to. These books were compiled and edited by whoever was responsible for the final form of the book of Deuteronomy. And the consensus among most biblical scholars is that these historical books, and even the Torah as well, reached their final form during the Babylonian exile. Okay, now, so the historical books were compiled from older historical sources. So the book of Yashar is just one of at least 21 books that are cited as sources in these historical books. So if you look through, there's all kinds of references to. We're not going to mention all of the other deeds of King so-and-so, because are they not recorded in the annals of the deeds of the kings of Israel? Well, maybe they were, but we don't have the annals of the kings of Israel anymore, unfortunately. So yeah, there's at least 21 books that are referenced in the Old Testament, and those would have been the primary sources maybe they could have been citing older sources older sources as well, but we don't know because they're all lost to us now. I'm not aware that we have any portions of any of these previous books other than what is now in the books of the Bible. But nonetheless, despite the fact that we don't know anything about the book of Yashar other than it's mentioned twice in the Old Testament. Beyond that, we know nothing of it. But that, nonetheless, good old Dr. Birch said that there was an annual convention of biblical scholars that he used to go to. He said it never failed that there was some guy who would come up and go, he had the trench coat on like the guy from Sesame Street, and go, "Hey, bud, you want to buy the last book of Yashar?" Oh, that would have been a lot of fun. Anyway, so just one of many books lost to us, except for that some of its content made it into the Old Testament. So we've crossed over from 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel, and the crossover point is where Saul dies. Saul and his sons die. So 1 Samuel, they're named Samuel. Of course, Samuel is already dead too. The 1 Samuel is actually about Samuel and Saul. 2 Samuel is about David and not Samuel at all. So what can we say about this story? Talk about shoot the messenger, right? So the conventional interpretation of this story is that the messenger that comes to David is lying, at least about something, okay? The general consensus is the account of Saul's death at the end of 1 Samuel is the accurate account of Saul's death, that he fell on his sword. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it means he took his sword and he put the hilt of the sword on the ground and put the tip of the sword up under his rib cage and then just fell forward onto it so that it would pierce through him. It's a way of committing suicide in the ancient world with a broadsword. And these would have been short broadswords, not long broadswords like the ones that they might not even technically be called broadswords, but they're shaped like short broadswords. And these would have been bronze. This is the very late Bronze Age. The Philistines were in the Iron Age, but Israel was in the Bronze Age. So they would take the sword, brace on the ground, fall forward onto it to commit suicide. And he's doing that because he's already mortally wounded and he doesn't want to be captured, he doesn't want to be tortured. So the assumption is that that is in fact how he died, which means that when the messenger came upon him, he was not still alive. He was dead. He did not ask the messenger to kill him. The messenger did not comply by killing him. Saul had asked his armor bearer to kill him, but his armor bearer wouldn't do it. Wasn't willing to raise a hand against his king. And then after the king died, then the armor bearer did what would have been considered in those days the honorable thing, I guess, and took his own life as well, because you don't want to be... The king's bodyguard does not want to outlive the king. That would not be a good situation, because everybody would ask, well, if you're the king's bodyguard and you're here, where's the king? You're supposed to die defending him, right? So he's lying, and this messenger expects to be... So what he really did then was he came upon dead Saul and his sons, took the crown, and took the armband. And then what is he going to do with the crown and the armband? He could have gone back to Israel and said, hey, we're going to find out later that Saul still has one living son left, okay? Hey, Cindy, you made it. So he could have taken it back to Israel, or he could have handed it over to the Philistines. What does he do? He goes and takes it to David, okay? This is a political move. He thinks that he's going to be rewarded for bringing the items to David, because David needs them if David's going to be king. The other reason he thinks he's going to be rewarded is because he assumes that David is going to take this as good news. Good news that his enemy has died, that the obstacle to him taking the throne is gone. He does not count on David grieving Saul and Jonathan, which he does legitimately grieve both of them. So, then David kills the messenger. Or more accurately, he has one of his men kill the messenger, and we'll talk about later. And it becomes clear, and David talks more about this later, he's not just killing him because he claimed to kill the king. As far as he knows, he did kill the king, okay? Because David wasn't on Mount Gilboa. He doesn't know what really happened. He just knows what this guy says happened. This guy says he killed the king. So he's going to kill him for killing the king, because if you're on Israelite side, you're not supposed to kill the king. But he's also killing him because he's angry that this guy thinks it's good news. That this guy thinks David will think it's good news, because David considers himself to be a loyal son of Israel. And if he's a loyal son of Israel, then he's not going to raise a hand against his king, nor is he going to be happy when the king dies. He's certainly not going to be happy that his countrymen have fallen in battle. As far as he's concerned, this is a sad day all around, and any normal person would know this. So why is this guy here expecting to be rewarded for telling me the good news? This is a bad person, and he's going to die. So the messenger is not exactly an Israelite. He is, okay? And, I mean, there's a little bit of discussion about that. We don't know exactly how citizenship worked, other than it was more fluid than most people today give it credit for. There are multiple instances through these history books of groups that were not originally part of Israel becoming part of Israel. For example, Jerusalem is not yet part of Israel. It's a city, and it's populated by the Jebusites, and they're going to become part of Israel when David takes the city. Okay, so this guy is the son of an Amalekite, but he was born in Israel, so he's on Israel's side. But was he not raised well enough to know how David would have reacted, or did he just not know David well enough to know how David would have reacted? David's probably thinking any sane person would have been upset by this. No sane, good person who loves Israel is going to be excited to hear that Saul has died. Now, I'm somewhat troubled by the fact that David did not kill him himself. This is the beginning, for what I see, as a trend in David. Up until this point, David has always been willing to get his hands dirty. And we skipped over some of the stuff he did when he was leading his private army. He was a gun for hire, and they did some questionable things, never to Israel, but to Israel's enemies. But he was happy to profit off of persecuting Israel's enemies. Sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but he's always been willing to get his hands dirty. From this point out, David is not going to want to get his hands dirty. He's going to want bad things to happen to people he doesn't like, but he's not going to do it himself. In some cases, he's going to order other people to do it. In some cases, he's not going to give the order, but he knows that he doesn't have to, because Joab is going to fix it. We haven't talked about Joab yet. I think we mentioned his name once in a previous story. He's come onto the scene fairly recently as an active player. He's David's uncle, but he's also David's top general. And Joab is always going to be there when there's dirty work to be done. And Joab's stories do not appear in the lectionary at any point, so most of you have probably never heard anything about Joab. Joab is one of the most fascinating people in the Bible. He became a trope, not a literary trope, but a historical trope. You know, whenever you see okay, he's a literary trope too, but both in fiction and in history, whenever you see a leader who's got kind of a pit bull that he'll sick on people, like, if you have you often see portrayals of leaders who have a pretty decent moral compass. They know right and wrong, and sometimes they're between a rock and a hard place, and they got to bend the rules, and they don't want to bend the rules themselves, but they've always got this guy over here. You've got your chief of staff, and he knows what needs to be done, and he's just going to do it, and he's not going to tell me he did it, because then I can get in trouble too. Plausible deniability. This happens throughout history, happens throughout literature, and it happens here. Joab is the person Joab's not in this particular story. He was just a random guy next to him. Kill this guy. But in the future, it's going to be Joab. Joab's going to handle David's dirty work. And we'll talk about this more, I'm sure. I just can't talk about Joab enough. It's one of those things where Joab will do something terrible for David. And David will stand up in front of the people and say, this was an absolute tragedy. This never should have happened. Joab never should have done this. That is all. And he'll go inside. Does Joab get fired or punished? No. Joab keeps his job so he can do it again. This is the beginning of heading down what I see as a dark path for David. David's most noble days, unfortunately, are now behind him. He's going to be a much, much, much better king than Saul was. But I don't think he's the king that God hoped he would be. What does the story tell us about God? And that's actually kind of an open question. Because some people may disagree. God doesn't say or do anything in this story. David says and does stuff in this story. And it is clear that he's saying and doing the things that he's saying and doing based on his understanding of what God's will is, particularly when it pertains to God's anointed. Remember, kings have to be chosen and anointed by God. And the writers are clearly in the camp. The writers here of this history are clearly in the camp that David does in fact accurately understand God's will and is right to do what he does, in particular with killing this messenger. But at no point does God say, David, do this, or David, this is what really happened. David discerns all of that on his own based on his understanding of God. So then what does this story tell us about ourselves? Now, one of the commentaries I read is the Bible for Everyone, and the Old Testament portion of it was written by John Goldengay. And he says that he's noticed that Americans always feel sorry for the messenger. And he says he thinks that Americans tend to feel sorry for the messenger because the messenger is an opportunist. And that here in America, we value opportunism more highly than we value collegiality and doing what is in the common good, what is in the best interests of the community. So we look at this messenger and we say, oh, come on, Saul was going to die anyway. He just put him out of his misery. He didn't really do anything really wrong. Why did David have to kill him? And he thinks that our perspective on this is colored by the fact that he thinks we would do the same thing in that situation, and perhaps we should not do the same thing in that situation. That's his take on it. Now, granted, this observation of American culture is being made by a British expatriate who was at that time living in Pasadena, California. I'm sure that was quite a bit of a culture shift for him. He was there for decades, but he always viewed California culture as an outsider. Maybe that colored his perspective. And of course, California culture is not American culture. It's a subculture. David definitely has no patience with people who challenge the crown. And that's going to be a pattern we see going forward as well. He does kill people who do not properly respect the authority of the throne. And he was a man of his time in that respect. He was also, better than a lot of his peers, at least at this point in his life. Later in his life, I'm going to say he was kind of more like a typical king. But at this point in life, he is better than his peers. We would not act in the same way today. I don't think we would have killed the messenger for this. Probably would have had a conversation about it. It was interesting because people who have a problem with euthanasia tend to not have a problem with it on the battlefield. And really the ethical situation isn't any different. If somebody's clearly dying, the settings are different, but is the ethical question different? Anyway, so we probably would not do the same thing today. Even if we did what the messenger did, we wouldn't handle it the way David handled it probably. But I think that at the same time, we've lost too much respect for authority. We've lost too much respect for office. It's not just us, the rank and file, that don't respect authority the way we should. Even the authorities themselves do not respect their office as they should. And I think that that's an across-the-board Western world statement. But that's just my opinion. I'm just a guy with a webcam. What does this tell us about our relationship with God and with each other? Well, first, know how to read a room. This messenger, he did not read the room well. If he had read the room, he would have known that this was a bad idea before he... The minute he said that Saul and Jonathan were dead, he should have seen in David's eyes, I'm going to have to tread carefully from here on out, and maybe I shouldn't embellish the story by saying that I killed him when in fact I did not. Maybe this was not a well-conceived plan. A person who can read the room would have known that this was an ill-conceived plan the minute he started talking to David. Having said that, I know that a lot of my early leadership blunders were because I did not know how to read a room. Sometimes I still wonder. Sometimes you look at people and you think, I'm not sure how this is landing on them. I can't read them. Some people are hard to read. What else does it tell us? God called Saul. Like it or not, God called Saul. And he called Saul partially to be a bad example. But the thing is, no matter who God calls to do something for God, God doesn't typically call the people we think God should call to do those things. And that is simply not our call. We don't get to decide who God is going to choose. And, in the modern world, God doesn't choose the best and the brightest to lead his people or to do whatever task God wants done. God calls everybody to do stuff. Most people don't show up for it, though. Most people don't say, sir, yes, sir, and do what God has called them to do. So God has to work with whoever God gets. And that means we have to work with whoever God gets. And when those people fail, we should not take pleasure in their failures, especially when they are responsible for other people. And this is maybe this is the part of the story that we really need to wrestle with the most today. If we're an Israelite and we don't like the king, and the king dies in battle along with thousands of our comrades, should we be happy that the king we didn't like died? I'm going to say no. So when we're the American people and we don't like whoever happens to be in the office of the president at the moment, and they fail miserably while they're leading our nation, including us, should we take delight in that failure? Should we hope they will fail so that they don't get reelected again? Because in the ancient world, that kind of talk would get you shot. Shoot the messenger. All right. That's all I have for us for the scripture this week. I don't really have anything from the news other than just local Otterbein news here. So for those of you who don't know, we had a community Christmas party here on Sunday evening, meaning that our church were the church members were the hosts and the community were the guests. And we invited the community, and boy, did they come. They really came. And the building was packed, and it was a hoot. We weren't quite prepared for as many people as we had. And we're a downtown church, and some of the people who attended had let's just say downtown life challenges. So there was a little bit of excitement at times, but a good time. Well, I can't say a good time was had by all, but a good time was had by most of us. And I'm hoping that at the end of the week, everybody will look back on the memory fondly. I certainly know that I will. And the huge majority of the people that I've talked to have as well. So this week, we've distributed the presents for the children that we adopted for Christmas. And I can't tell this story right now, but someday in a different church, it's going to make for a great sermon. Every time I tell a story in a sermon about a previous church, because the story is amusing and has a point, people say, wait a minute, you going to talk about us like that in your next church? I say, yes, I am. And if you want to be the hero in that story, you'd better act heroic now. But anyway, no, this week's story that I can't tell you, it was just a comedy of errors, most of which were not made by Otterbein people. We just had to deal with the logistics afterwards. And the bottom line is, on Friday, I'm going to be driving 2 hours north into Pennsylvania to deliver toys to a person who didn't realize that their kids were being adopted by a church in a different state. And how did I not find that out? Because I didn't ask. I just assumed they knew who they were talking to and that they were in Hagerstown, because everybody else was in Hagerstown. And so what did you learn from that, Pastor Steve? Oh, my goodness. All right, so this is the last time I'll see you guys, some of you anyway, until next year. And some of you I will see in church on Sunday. Some of you I will see in church on Sunday evening. Some of you I'll probably see online Sunday morning or Sunday evening. And the rest of you, well, to everybody, I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. God bless you all, everyone. Let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer, shall we? God, give me grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Tom Brown joined us too. All right, folks. Once again, Merry Christmas and God bless.